Requesting connection. Established. Encrypted. We're live. The show you've been asking for. Advice, technology, and community. Linux first, all others second. This is Ask Noah.
Live from Multispeed Technologies, the Ask Noah show starts right now. This is the show where we came to do all the things on Linux they said couldn't be done and take your questions on how to do the same. The phone lines are open this hour. To be a part of the program, it is a free call, 1-855-450-NOAH. That's 1-855-450-6624, or send an email to live@asknoahshow.com. My name is Noah Chalaya. I am your host. Delighted to be here with you as another episode of the Ask Noah show kicks off this hour. No Steve this week. He's off gallivanting around Texas, so I'm on my own, but that's okay. We'll dig into your feedback and ride the train as always. Our first email comes in from Baku. Baku writes in and says, "Hi there, guys. I'm not an expert on this, but if my understanding is right, ZFS will be continued to be available on future versions of Ubuntu. Canonical will be deprecating ZSys from the future versions, though. ZFS on root and ZSys are two totally separate things. ZSys departure from Ubuntu doesn't mean the end of ZFS on Ubuntu. A cool project called ZFS Boot Menu can be a great alternative to ZSys. A link to the project page, and he links to docs.zfsbootmenu.org. If someone is interested in a lightweight alternative of Wiki.js, I'd highly encourage them to take a look at Pepperminty Wiki. It is simple to install, upload a single file, doesn't require complex databases, and has all the usual wiki features. Noah, this one has a dark mode and, drumroll please, random page option. Link to the project page, peppermint.mooncarrot.space. Thank you very much, Baku. I appreciate you writing in. So, I'm glad I reached out to a couple of people after I saw ZSys was being deprecated and just said, hey, any word on the street of what might happen to ZFS and Ubuntu? And is that a sign of things to come? And the answer I got back was a resounding no. ZFS is there to stay. And obviously, the primary development is happening in OpenZFS, so it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. It would fundamentally break a whole bunch of stuff if that were ever to happen. But you're right. ZFS and ZSys are two entirely separate things. And I'll be honest with you, I recognize that there is value to having the ability to roll back, do a kernel rollback, those sorts of things. But I'm not personally in that boat. And here's why. I have transitioned to this model of treating computers like cattle as opposed to pets. Therefore, there is no super special config. Even on my day-to-day laptop that I use every single day, everything that I need to make it my puppy is reproducible via Ansible. So there's very little benefit in me having to roll back. I have no problem, zero, zip, zilch, of blowing my operating system away and replacing it and starting all over. In fact, and I think I mentioned this on a previous episode, I was reading one of Kevin Mitnick's latest books, Ghost in the Wire. And one of the things that he talks about in that book is starting from a premise of being anonymous and then working your way up to identifying yourself only when you absolutely have to. And at first it sounded like a gigantic pain in the tuchus to me, and I thought, there's no way. There's just no way. I can't do that. But I tried it and I gave it a shot. And so what that looks like is you set Firefox up to every time that you open a new Firefox window, you're essentially getting a fresh browser. There are no cookies. And it doesn't have any history, nothing like that, which makes long you get to banking sites. And there are some sites that just like Google, it doesn't know how to deal with itself. It gets so upset that, hey, this is a new person every time. That's crazy. But after a few weeks, I kind of settled into it. And so having my PIA, private internet access VPN set up, automatically connects. My connection tunnels out to a set point in the world. Then from there, it goes out to all of the individual services, and I stay anonymous, or as anonymous as I can be. I haven't found it to be too much of a burden. As part of that process, again, it strips away this idea of everything is saved, everything is set up the way I want. I import a couple of bookmarks, a couple of folders of bookmarks, really. I sign into my password manager, and now I have access to a web browser. So it's all of like 30 seconds to set that up from scratch. So I don't care a lot. But if you're interested, if you're one of those people that like, man, I spent hours drilling in the perfect setup, this is a great way to do that, because undeniably being able to roll snapshots back is just amazing. In fact, we had an Ultimate client, and they had suffered ransomware in the past, and they suffered it again, but this time we had a TrueNAS box in there. And so they called us and said, oh my gosh, hold on. We log in, run a couple commands, check now. Oh my gosh, that's great. Yes, it is, isn't it? So it can definitely save your butt if you need it. And so we'll have a link to the zfsbootmenu.org in the show notes. You can find those at podcast.asknoahshow.com. And yes, if you are looking for a lightweight wiki, Pepperminty Wiki, great thing to check out. I will tell you that I have just gone to the moon and back to get everything moved over from MediaWiki over to WikiJS. So I'm a little, the wound is a little too raw for me to try to jump around right now, but I'll definitely circle back and take a look at it. Our second email comes in from Adam. Adam writes in and says, "Hi, Noah and Steve. Life circumstances have caused me to reevaluate my current situation. Long story short, I currently work as a data center tech. Before this, I was a Linux system administrator for 3 years, and then my position was outsourced. Linux has been my passion for several years, and now I'm trying to get a job doing that again. And this is part of the change that I need to make in myself. I'm not necessarily asking for a paid position, but something that I could work on or get me some experience so that I can add it to my resume. How do I go about finding some places to gain experience to make yourself more attractive for a Linux position?" So it's a great question, Adam. There's a couple ways that you can do it. So the first thing that you can do is you can start volunteering for open source projects, because oftentimes what will happen is other companies will find people that are volunteering for those projects and they'll pick you up. Red Hat is notorious for this. They'll go find, typically Red Hat is doing it where they'll go find somebody that is running a project or doing a project and say, "You're doing a really good job over there. Come do that for us. And we'll just hand you a paycheck. Just keep doing what you're doing." I want to connect with you directly. I think we might be able to help you, or might be able to get you connected to some places, maybe even at Altispeed. So I would love to have that dialogue. The timing, I would encourage you to go back and listen to a previous episode of this show, the Altispeed Origin Stories. And it kind of walks through where we are as a company and kind of where we're skating to. And I think that will give you some insight into your task. But I love the idea of getting back into Linux. I like the premise that you're starting from, and I love the idea that you're willing to give a taste of your services, so to speak, so that you can further, you've got the exact right attitude. This is the right path to go down. You just need to get connected a little bit more to some of the community resources, and I think people are looking for talent. So I don't think you'll have a problem landing a job at all. Our third email comes in from Mike. Mike says, "Hi, Noah and Steve. I want to thank you for helping me diagnose a network issue, even though you never knew I had a problem." We're that good. "But now I need to know why it was solved. Needless to say, I'm a Linux hobbyist, not one of your industry pro listeners. I was in the process of writing you a huge email describing my pfSense network with 2 VLANs, and the issue where an MB client on VLAN 130 could not access the media server on VLAN 100. Everything else worked great, except the clients on VLAN 130 could not access the media server no matter what I did in pfSense. Clients on the media server's VLAN 100 could access the media server just fine. And as I was writing the troubleshooting, I found the issue with Docker networking on the media server itself. I found almost all of my Docker networks were using a 172 address, while my pfSense network is using a 192 system. I noticed that my Docker containers had networks which used a 192 address. When deleted, those Docker networks, presto, my issue was resolved. My clients across VLANs could now access the media server. My question, what did I do? I have no idea why a couple of container networks with the 192 address kept my network from being able to communicate across 2 VLANs, even though the communication on the same VLAN was fine. Do you have any sage wisdom to help to explain what was going on? Lastly, I'm using Portainer to manage my Docker containers. Is there anything that I can do to prevent Portainer from assigning 192 addresses in the future? Thanks for all you do for the community, Mike." So if you kind of think about this like an address at your house, it's the best way to explain this. So your router does something, well, actually, all machines do something called a gateway of last resort. And essentially what that is if you're existing on the same network, so you're on a 192 address and somebody else is on a 192 address, it goes to the switch and says, "Hey, Mr. Switch, who has this address? Which MAC address do I send these frames to?" And the switch goes and references this to ARP table and says, "Well, that IP address is attached to this MAC address, and this MAC address is sitting on this port, so I'm going to send those frames over here." And it handles that for you. And so when you're working all in one network, that's fine. When the client, whatever it is, doesn't know where to send network packets, it says, hey, I'm not aware of that, and I don't see it anywhere on anything that I can see. It sends it to its gateway of last resort. It's sometimes called a default route or a default gateway. And that is your router. So in the case of pfSense, when you have two VLANs, effectively you have two networks. And what pfSense is doing is it takes the traffic from one VLAN and says, I know about both of these networks. I know where this goes. And then, presumingly that you have all of your firewall rules set up, forwards that traffic onto the appropriate network, and it makes its way to the appropriate client. The problem that you ran into is when you had a 192 address on your Docker container, that machine no longer knows to send the packets to its gateway of last resort because it thinks it knows where the 192 network is. It says it's right here, right in my Docker network. See, it's right here. But it can't find that specific host. And so that's why you're having trouble getting between those two VLANs. And so when you remove that second 192 network, now the computer says, I know about all the 172 networks that are around here. That's all my Docker networks. Where's this 192 thing you're talking about? Don't know. Send it to pfSense. pfSense, do you know? pfSense says, yep, I do, right over here. And Bob's your uncle, it works. As far as using Portainer to stop assigning a 192 address, I don't know off the top of my head, but I'm sure somebody in the community will write back live@asknoahshow.com and let me know. Our third email comes in from Hive H. This is from the chat room at GeekLab.Ninja. Following your recommendation to look around Sophos firewalls, I've had a great experience. I found the Sophos SG330 and XG330 are essentially the same hardware. I've converted one of them to OpenSense. Installing OpenSense is easy since there's an HDMI port on the back. I just popped a new SSD drive in there and booted off the OpenSense install image on a USB drive. Installed onto the USB SATA drive and everything just works. For fun, I swapped the i5-6500 CPU for an i7-6700T CPU, and the i7-6700T is recognized by the BIOS and works fine, reducing the power to about 4 watts with a kilowatt. I also replaced a fan with the Noctua from the box, and it's very quiet. For more fun, I converted a WatchGuard XT-M5 Box 505 to OpenSense. All that was required was putting OpenSense on the boot image with several console support on a compact flash drive, and then booting off of that using a Cisco USB console cable to run the OpenSense installer. I installed OpenSense on an SD drive. Since there's already power in the box, all I did was add a SATA cable. This obviously has less horsepower than the Sophos box, but it was only $40 on eBay. Anyway, I thought your listeners might get some of the details from the folks that have followed your advice to keep hardware out of the landfill and get a great overall value. Thanks for all you do. So yeah, thank you, Hive. I appreciate it. And it is, those OpenSense boxes are literally some of the best hardware out there to run routing software on there. And yeah, it's a much more green solution than buying another piece of hardware. It's great to be able to use some of this really well-built enterprise hardware because at the end of the day, underneath the box, it's just a little Intel computer. And it just happens to be a little Intel computer that happens to have really nice, big, pipey Ethernet cards in it and is set up specifically to be a firewall appliance. All right, we've got an interview with the Jellyfin folks. They're standing by. First, we'll head over to Linux Newswire and get the latest from JT. Here he is.
From the Linux Newswire newsroom, this is the Week in Review with JT.
For the week of February 5th, 2023, here's the Linux and open source headlines. Now in its 20th year of supporting and promoting the free and open source community, Scale 20X, the Southern California Linux Expo, will be held in the Pasadena Convention Center March 9th to March 12th. LF Energy, the Linux Foundation's sub-foundation focused on the power sector, has announced 4 different conferences for 2023. And Red Hat has announced a Display HDR Hackfest in Brno in the Czech Republic in late April. The Slack's minimalist distribution has released version 15.0.1 with a new DynFileFS fuse file system for storing persistent changes onto boot media. Hot on the heels of OBS Studio 29 release, the OBS team has rolled out 29.0.1 with a lot of fixes. Docker 23 has been released. The open source Tycoon Deluxe Remake, OpenTTD, has released version 13. LibreOffice 7.5 is out. eBook Library Manager Calibre has released version 6.12, and OpenSSL 3.0.7 has been released. Royal Ransomware is the latest ransomware operation to add support for encrypting Linux devices in its most recent malware variants, specifically targeting VMware ESXi virtual machines. According to cybersecurity company SentinelOne, a Chinese threat actor known as DragonSpark has been exploiting the open-source remote administration tool RatSpark in recent attacks on East Asian enterprises. Hewlett-Packard Enterprise issued a critical alert last Wednesday tied to its OneView infrastructure management platform, warning of a use-after-free vulnerability that allows remote attackers to execute arbitrary code on targeted systems, leak data, or create conditions for RIPE or denial-of-service attacks. NetApp and IBM have also issued warnings as well. Doubling down on its commitment to full open-source reproducibility of the most current Rocky Linux bug fixes, security patches, and feature enhancements, CIQ engineers have released the Rocky Linux 9 errata subsystem as an open-source project and fully integrated it with their open-source build system called Peridot. In the other direction, the company Datadog allegedly asked the developer to kill the open-source data export tool that he had written. The developer behind the jailbreaking tool Rainstorm has released evidence that Voice.ai is violating the terms of the GPL v3 and LGPL v2.1 by bundling Pratt and libgcrypt into the Voice AI's proprietary software. Google appears to be laying off many of its best employees in their open source program office, including Chris DeBona, the founder of the group, as well as the co-creator of Samba, Jeremy Allison. Intel's RISC-V dev development, Pathfinder, which was revealed in August of 2022, appears to be discontinued, with Intel having no plans to support it. GitHub CEO Thomas Domke says that open-source developers should be made exempt from the European Union's proposed new artificial intelligence regulations. The AI Act assigns applications of AI to 3 risk categories. First, applications and systems that create an unacceptable risk, such as government-run social scoring of the type used in China, are banned. Second, high-risk applications, such as CV scanning tools that ranks job applicants, are subject to specific legal requirements. Lastly, applications not explicitly banned or listed as high risk are largely left unregulated. The proposal does not confer any rights on individuals, but instead regulates the providers of artificial intelligence systems and entities making use of them in a professional capacity, limiting how big businesses can use AI. And lastly, the National Science Foundation is looking to foster the development of open source ecosystem in STEM fields, and has allocated $28 million for new open source ecosystems.
Thank you, JT. Joining me on the Ask Noah show is Anthony Lovato release manager Joshua Boniface, the project lead and one hit song software maintainer for the Roku client. Welcome, gentlemen, into Ask Noah.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for having us.
I appreciate you guys taking the time. So I want to start here. For those people who maybe haven't heard of Jellyfin, or maybe they've just kind of followed on the periphery, how did Jellyfin get started? What is it?
So I'll jump in on that one. So pretty much the origin of Jellyfin lies in MB. So most of us were MB users when we first started the project, and the decision of MB to kind of go closed source and just generally be fairly hostile towards the free and open source community was really an impetus for us to kind of take it our own way, so to speak. So they really announced they were going closed source in late November 2018, and we pretty much immediately were able to jump in and say, well, wait a minute, we want a GPL, free software media streamer out there, and we forked their 3.5.2 code base, and we're able to attract enough developers to really keep it going and build the solution we have today.
So a lot of open source names make me giggle or laugh, and I think it's always interesting to find out where the origins of these names come from. So you're forking a project essentially and taking it, make sure to maintain it as an open source project. That was the idea from the beginning with MB, right? And so when that split, then you said, okay, to hold true to open source values, then we need to pick this up and carry on. How did you land on Jellyfin?
So actually, the origins of that are pretty much a mystery to all of us. One of the people who was involved in the original fork, who isn't very involved in the project these days, but Andrew, came up with the name. We were kind of throwing a bunch of names around, and I'm terrible at naming stuff, so I was coming up with names like, oh, we could call it OpenBee or something like that. And he said I came up with these like 3 or 4 names, and of them, Jellyfin seemed the most ridiculous and jumped out the most at me. So I'm like, let's go with that. I like it. It's distinctive. People will remember this, exactly. And the rest is history.
I love that. I love that. So what have been some of the biggest hurdles? I've never functioned as a software developer and never forked a project before, but I imagine that's quite an undertaking. What sort of things has been a struggle for you guys?
I can give my perspective first, and then maybe if Anthony or One Hit Song want to jump in. But for us, I think there's been different hurdles for different periods of the project. At the very beginning, our biggest hurdle was just getting a working solution. From day one, we had a pretty working server. I mean, there was things that were broken, but for the most part, what we really lacked was clients and just the ability to actually get a build out there to a lot of users. So, initially we really struggled with that. It took about a solid, year and a half to really get that to a point where we were comfortable saying, yeah, this actually has some family acceptance factor, let's call it. And, there's an app for at least a few major devices, and the server's pretty stable, and you can install it on, basically any operating system you want. And then later on, more recently, what we've actually really struggled with is something I've written about myself, which is what I'll call the open source bystander problem. And basically, it's the case that we built a really great team, but being that we're all volunteers, there's been a slow and steady drop off in the ability to really develop the project. Early on, a lot of us were able to put in, crazy numbers of hours, almost full-time job level hours into the project on a week-to-week basis. And, that's not obviously sustainable long-term. So we've kind of hit a plateau now where we're really looking for, for lack of a better word, some new blood into the project, and really hoping to get some new people, contributing and implementing some features and getting some additional work done to kind of help us get over this hump that we're in.
What kind of help specifically are you looking for? Are you looking for software developers? Are you looking for people that can help fix bugs? Are you looking for people to write documentation? What would be most helpful and powerful to the project right now?
Well, I think for pretty much all of those things. That's kind of, both the beauty of an open source project like this that's purely volunteer run, and also kind of one of its limitations is that, we're always looking for someone to do something. And it can be whatever, a person thinks could be valuable. So, I mean, there is like a huge backlog of issues and bugs, backlogs of features, things that I know people have brought up time and time again as things that they'd like, but, no one's really moved towards developing it. And, on the same token, there's lots of functionality in the program that might be missed or might be, not immediately obvious, that is something where, if someone's used that feature, having someone document it would be key, because, it's something that kind of ties into, our philosophy and our model of working, where, we tend to scratch our own itch, to use the term. So, my use case is totally different than probably, One Hit Song's use case, or from some user's use case. We might all have very, very different ideas about, what we use this software for. So if there's functionality that, I've never touched in all my years of using it, that someone else might consider a really critical piece of the program or piece of the solution for them, then that's, very hard for me to document, but it's something that person, it would be amazing if, they were able to come in and say, oh yeah, I use this feature all the time, here's how you set it up, here's how you'd use it, that sort of thing. And that's from the documentation side, something that would be really valuable to the project.
I love that. I've said it numerous times in this program. I believe it's just true to the core that the people who are passionate about their own problems are sometimes the people that come up with some of the best solutions, because they're eating their own dog food, right? And so when you come across a niche that doesn't work for you, you change it. I want to explore that a little bit further. So you guys eat, live, and breathe Jellyfin. So if you're sitting down in your home and you're going to go purchase hardware to set up and install the server side of Jellyfin, and you're going to go set up the client side of Jellyfin, what kind of things would you purchase, and kind of walk me through that process of how would you get that set up?
So I think in terms of hardware, one of the benefits of the software is that it can run on a very, very wide range of, systems, basically. We've seen people running it on Raspberry Pis, on small little, like Intel NUC boxes or small mini PCs, all the way up to crazy people like me who have a rack of like 8 servers in their basement. that they just happen to run it in one of their VMs. So really, if someone's coming into it fresh, it really depends on their needs. The biggest hurdle being transcoding support. So hardware transcoding is one of our, kind of key feature differentiators. Both Plex and MB charge for that. We provide it for free and do a lot of work to optimize it. But the hardware that you'd run hardware transcoding on is, one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle. So there's a lot of flexibility in the sense that, if you're willing to make sure that all your clients are compatible with all your media at all times, you can run it on like a tiny little, 2-watt Raspberry Pi, no transcoding, and it'll just act as basically a back-end media manager, versus someone like, say, me. I stream to my family over a very slow internet connection, so I make extremely heavy use of hardware transcoding on an NVIDIA GPU to lower the bitrate of the video to something that can actually be streamed over the internet. So I require a pretty substantial GPU to run that, and really everything in between. That's kind of the beauty of the kind of self-hosted home lab scenario, is you can really work with anything you want. I think in terms of hardware, a lot of people, they might get a used server from work, or they might find a good deal on eBay, or even just go out and purchase a NUC or something like that from a retail store and get started on that. And I think having that flexibility is a real benefit. They can get started and at least mess around with it without really investing a lot of money if they don't want to.
And on the client side, we're trying to kind of meet everybody where they are, right? So if you already have some equipment that you can use, whether it's an Amazon Fire Stick or Chromecast with Google TV or a Roku, we've got clients that already run on those platforms, and they're getting better all the time. So of course, the ultimate client would be a PC or something that you can run Kodi on, but we've got our own clients that have been making leaps and bounds in transcoding support, being able to play back content natively without having to rely on hardware transcoding. So people can use a Raspberry Pi or another low-power PC as their server and get the best experience possible. And that's why we're pushing a lot now with sort of the more popular devices. So we just recently, in the past couple months, expanded our LG WebOS support, for example, and that's also still a growing process. And then from there, next up is Samsung Tizen. We've got a client that you can install if you're a little more technically inclined, but we want to be right there in the store with everybody else, and it takes a lot of work to get there. But once we're there, we'll meet people where they are on the most popular places.
I love that. So, you said a couple of things there that piqued my interest. So I love the idea of meeting people where they are, because it really is how people win over a market, is meeting them in what they're already doing. It's kind of the example I use is the whole Lotus 1-2-3 and how Excel kind of took over by first meeting users where they were with the spreadsheet. So I love that idea. But you also said working with Kodi. You said if you had if resources were infinite and you weren't constrained to anything, perhaps a PC with Kodi running on, could we dig into that a little bit? So you don't see yourself as a competitor to Kodi per se. This is something that might work really well hand in hand.
Yeah. So whether it's Kodi or our own, for example, Jellyfin Media Player, which is a desktop client with MPV in it, so it can play a lot of formats and things natively. Some people like the Kodi interface, for example, or some people might like our interface. So wherever they are comfortable, we've got some way to hopefully integrate and get into bring their content to that place.
I love that. That's the beauty of open source, everything being able to work together. A couple of more technical questions. How soon would you guys consider, or might you be looking at something like MySQL or a Postgres server for the database?
That's a very good question, and it's actually one of I think it might be our oldest feature request, because it's something I wanted out of MB before we even formed Jellyfin. And I think it was the second or third thing I said we should do this.
Just a really big itch.
Yeah, exactly. whether you want to run it redundantly or just to, take a load off that main system. The main limitation to that has been the fact that, and I want to try to be a little bit generous here, but it's hard to get around it, that the code from MB was not in any way conducive to that. It was tied so, I'll say incorrectly, into just raw SQLite schemas in the back end that we've effectively had to take on the project of rewriting the entirety of the media storage backend in order to be able to support that. And we're about 60% of the way there. But that last 40% is the huge hurdle, because that's the kind of core, here is the media and what is it storing? Like, what are all the titles, the actors, stuff like that. So there's been a long running project, and we have a developer who's been working on that, on and off in his spare time for pretty much the past 1.5 to 2 years. And he's gotten quite far. As I said, we basically ported, there were 5 databases. We ported 4 of them to the new format. And then the 5th one is the really difficult one, because it's the one that really ties into the API and the backend. So at this point, we have no ETA on it. It could be 6 months, it could be 2 years, depending on, whether he's able to get that moving and, find the free time to work on it. But it's also, something that we really want out of the solution, to be able to fully decouple the, back-end database format from the front, like the actual server itself.
And I'm guessing it would go faster if there was a developer that showed up and said, hey, you know what? I know everything there is to know about back-end MySQL and Postgres server backends, and so I'll come along and help you guys do all of this. You just tell me how you kind of want it laid out, and I'll help you get the work done. That would be great, right?
That's pretty much exactly it. I mean, this guy we have working for us is very, very smart. It's Patrick Barron is his name. Okay. I'm pretty sure that's public. If not, he can crucify me. But yeah, he's been working on, that. But as I said, free time. So if there was someone who was able to come in as a developer who's got, that experience with the actual technology that we're moving to is called EF Core within the Microsoft .NET framework, and who's able to, help, like, hey, here's a schema that would work for, all storing all the metadata, and here's how we'd integrate the API endpoints. That would be something that would be really, really huge to the project. And hopefully, that's something that can materialize in the future.
How about donations? If somebody, like, let's say there were people out there that were able to contribute money to the project, maybe there could be enough eventually raised to pay for Patrick's time so that he could, take some time and develop some of these things that have been on the wish list for a long time.
Oh, that is a question. That is something that we have some very, very strong opinions on, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because it's something that's come up a lot in not just recent, but literally from day one of the project. We had people say, hey, can I contribute money to this? And one of our kind of core philosophical ideals, and one of my core philosophical ideals that I think everyone on the team at least somewhat agrees with, is that we want to keep money out of the project entirely. So a big factor in our decision to fork was MB going closed source. And I've always looked at this from the lens of, why did MB go closed source? Why did some other tools, like Plex was originally open source as far as I'm aware, why did they go closed source? Why did another project that I was tangentially related to a few years ago that I still use, AirSonic or Subsonic was the original one, why did they go closed source? And it really always comes back to one thing, that as soon as you add money to the project, as soon as it becomes something someone gets paid for, you end up with a perverse incentive for the project. It no longer is the case that, hey, we're just a bunch of people who love this solution and want to make it good. It suddenly becomes, hey, I have to make money off this. Or I am making money off this. How can I make more money off this? And you get into a situation that so many open source projects run into, where you have the monetization problem. And I think, at least, that a large number of the monetization models are actually user hostile. That's not something everyone might agree with, but I think they are. And that's something we really don't want the project to go down the slippery slope of, because I think once we get to that point, there's so many problems that come out of that, in the sense of, how much do you pay certain people for the work they do, who qualifies for getting money, and on the flip side, how much does it privilege a given user if they're able to throw $500 at or $1,000 at their feature, when maybe there's 100 people who can't afford that, who want another feature. So we've always taken the model and the idea that if we just keep money out of the project entirely, we never have to deal with those questions and those problems, and we can just say, look, it's volunteer based. Something gets implemented when it gets implemented, by someone who's just interested in doing it. And if that means that the project is a little slow to implement a certain feature, that's fine. That's just how we're going to operate and move forward. And one day, we might get that feature, we might never get that feature, but at the very least, I see it as a matter of integrity in that sense.
Do you worry at all that without having a funding model that it'll be difficult to attract and keep talent to keep the project moving?
I definitely think it is. And it is something we've had some issues with. It comes back to asking the question earlier about, how do we, get new contributors and all of that. And it definitely is an issue in one sense, but I also think it can be a blessing in the other sense, because it also removes, I think, a lot of pressure that might come into certain contributors to produce work for the purpose of getting a bug bounty, and like, I don't say, I'll give an example with like no names. It's not something anyone's actually done, but let's say, you had a $500 bug bounty and someone comes in and says, I really want to claim that bug bounty. I really need that money. Are they going to produce the best feature possible just because they want to make the money? Is it going to turn into a case of, well, what if there's a disagreement? Are there going to be 3 people trying to, implement this feature in different ways to make that money, and who wins? What if we, don't even want the feature, which is something we ran into earlier in the project, where someone made a bug bounty for a feature that we didn't want to implement. And we actually, Anthony can probably expand on this story, but we actually asked Bug Bounty to remove us from all of their, remove all bug bounties for our software from them, because we didn't want that incentive. And, it really is what it is. We kind of built the project around that philosophy and that idea. So we just kind of accept that it does make certain things harder, but it also makes certain things easier.
Anthony, would you mind sharing additional details? I'd be interested to learn, what was this bug bounty that was opened up on your behalf? It was a feature that you weren't particularly looking for?
The feature itself was support for playing back content from RAR files without having to extract them ahead of time. So keeping things in the actual RAR archives, split or whole, I don't recall. I think it didn't distinguish, but keeping them in the RAR archive and playing that back. And it was actually a feature request that this particular user had made on MB many years ago. And then when Jellyfin started, not long after, they actually contacted, and I forget the name of the website, but they contacted the bug bounty site and service and asked them to move the bounty over to a new issue that they had opened on the Jellyfin server repository. We pretty much looked at a couple options, as we do for most requests, just to kind of see, okay, is this something that we might take on? Is this something that might be feasible? Even ignoring the part about the bounty to begin with. And we just saw a lot of complications around dealing with RAR archives, since it is a proprietary compression format, and there's proprietary libs for handling that. So we sort of looked at it on the one sense, do we want to try and take on this kind of thing that could introduce other liabilities, or do we want to just kind of keep going? We never had the support, so do we just kind of keep going without that support? And so while we left a request as a thing that somebody can implement. We didn't want somebody to necessarily just run in and, like Joshua suggested, maybe make the like a quick, easy solution that wouldn't be the best for the future of the project. And we've changed so much even in the 4 years since that request was originally opened. So in that process of handling that, I actually reached out to the Bounty website and I said, hey, if there's any way that you can do this, we'd like to completely, be delisted from your platform. And it's funny too, because there's a lot of different places that do things like that. And some of them actually didn't even have a way for a project to get sort of delisted or get removed until I asked, actually. Just because we want to stick to that kind of idea that if you're going to do something with Jellyfin, we want you to be as passionate about it as we are, or as much as you can anyway, to help make the project better for everyone. It's there's something that we kind of don't talk about too often, which is that there's no real way to know how many people use Jellyfin, and that's sort of by design. There's no data that we collect through any of the server or any of the clients or anything, nothing that we collect on purpose. There are some involuntary things that come up. So like download stats from the Google Play Store or from the Apple App Store or the Roku Channel Store. And I even, as the release manager, when I go publish a release, I go right to publishing. I try not to look at any of that stuff there. But for the involuntary statistics, the last time I checked, which is maybe about a month ago, just because we were celebrating, quietly celebrating the anniversary of the project, I want to say we had something around 150,000 Android TV installs.
Wow.
100,000 on the Android phone client. Amazon doesn't give you any stats, so we don't know about that. And I don't remember the Apple stats. And Roku, One Hit Song, I don't know if you remember what the numbers were on that. I can't think of it off the top of my head.
I think it was, like 120, 130 maybe?
Yeah, I think so, easily.
Somewhere.
And that's just what we kind of know about. It doesn't count people that install the server and maybe just use the web client on their own, or use Kodi, or install the app themselves, like they sideload the app onto their device or anything, and the number just grows.
That's awesome. I'm thrilled that you guys are having such success, and I love the passion inside of the project. So tell me a little bit about where you see the future of Jellyfin. Where do you see it going? Could you see things like plans for OAuth 2 or other SSO providers?
I definitely think that's a feature that I know that it is a feature that's been requested, and it's absolutely something we'd love to implement. And I think it's one of those things where one aspect of the software that I think a lot of people do know about, but not necessarily like comprehend how it works, is that we actually have a fairly extensive plugin system that was inherited from MB, which is a fantastic feature of the software, where it's possible to write a plugin to do nearly everything that the server doesn't do. So, we have some basic ones where we have, a plugin for LDAP authentication that basically just hooks into the function that authenticates a user and does an LDAP lookup. We have a bunch of metadata providers in there, and that's something where I think there's great room for a plugin to do that. It hasn't been implemented yet, obviously by anyone, which is quite a shame because it is a popular feature request. I do know that, but it's also the case that we're really just waiting for someone who'd be interested in writing that functionality to come in and implement it, and then we could have that feature. It's the case of most of our features are like that. It's really just waiting on that itch that someone has, and someone's ability to scratch that itch and actually do the implementation, and then we're happy to include it. I mean, we'll do pretty much anything in a plugin if it's possible. So, we kind of go with that model as much as possible for that sort of extended functionality.
How about things that aren't plugin based, like for example hardware transcoding? What is recommended for somebody who maybe hears about what you were talking about with hardware transcoding and needing a very beefy graphics card? Where would you recommend somebody start with that? Could you give some examples of some hardware somebody might want to pick up?
Absolutely. Pretty much there's a lot of options in that space. I mean, as much as there are a lot of options for GPUs, 3, but really, we do support all the major players in that space. And there's, I think there's 7 or 8 different libraries involved in hardware transcoding. But really, if someone's coming in day one, hey, I have a fresh server, I want to implement this. There's kind of 2 big recommendations that at least I'd personally make based on my experiences and that seem to be pretty universal among the community. The first is NVIDIA, because NVIDIA GPUs and the NVENC and NVDEC libraries are extremely well supported in FFmpeg, which is what we use for the actual transcoding in the back end. And they're well supported by us. They work quite phenomenally. And there's actually a page, and I don't remember it off the top of my head. I'd have to search for it. But it's a page that someone put together, many years ago that's constantly updated for Plex, actually. But it goes through and lists every NVIDIA GPU and what their capabilities are for transcoding, from various formats to various formats, how many simultaneous streams you can expect to get out of them, that sort of thing. And I've posted that resource to people countless times to say, hey, if you're looking at the NVIDIA side, here's a comparison of GPUs and what you might want to consider as your options. And then the second big one is Intel QuickSync, which is also extremely well supported by FFmpeg and by us. And which is continually getting new features. Our FFmpeg developer, or main FFmpeg developer, has been really pushing that in recent, the last year or so, as a great option. It's far more power efficient because it's usually built into modern Intel CPUs. So at the very least, even if you don't have a dedicated GPU, if you have a QuickSync capable CPU, you can use this functionality. And it does very well with all the latest formats. Some of the future formats, I believe it does or will support AV1 encoding. All that. It's very easy to get going. So those are kind of the 2 I'd personally recommend to someone who's looking into hardware transcoding. But we do, of course, we also support, though it's less feature complete, we support the 2 main AMD protocols. VA API is kind of the big one, which is technically supposed to be cross GPU, and you can use every GPU type with it, but it's really only the better option for AMD based cards. And I personally haven't had much experience with that, but that's because I bought the wrong GPU and then bought an NVIDIA one later. But I know people use it all the time and it works quite well. There's also AMF, I believe it's called, does a similar thing to like NVENC and NVDEC, that it's like a specific AMD library. And then there is also technically support for the hardware encoder in the Raspberry Pi. And I can't remember if it's OMF or OVF or something like that is the name of it. It's more limited, but it is available, and I think people have gotten it working.
How about, this is kind of an offhanded question, but I hear that you guys are using Matrix and Element, and I'm a little bit of a Matrix and Element nerd, so even if we're talking primarily about Jellyfin, I gotta ask, tell me about the decision to go Matrix and Element. How's it been working as a communications platform?
That's a good question. It was actually something we decided pretty much like day one of the project. We were looking for, how do we coordinate with each other outside of GitHub? And how do we do real-time chat? And, of course, the first thing that popped into a lot of people's minds was, oh, let's set up a Discord. And among the kind of 4 or 5 main people who were chatting about this at the time, which was me, Anthony, Andrew, and then we had our Russian developer, Vasily, and someone else, I can't remember who else. We all kind of, like a bunch of us said, we don't really use Discord. And I said, no, I don't use Discord. I kind of hate it. So we looked into the options. Do we want to create a forum? Do we want to create this? And someone said, hey, have you heard of this Element chat system. It's a self-hosted, federated chat. And I mean, I kind of said, ooh, that sounds really interesting. Like, let's go with it. So we set up a few rooms on the main matrix.org instance, and I myself set up a home server for myself and Anthony, and a couple other people already had or set up home servers for it. And it really quickly took off as our kind of main chat system, just because it was actually, among the people early in the project, it was the one that everyone could agree to use. And then much later on, like maybe Anthony can correct me on this, but I think it was 2 years ago or so, we were able to set up bridges using some of the bridge software that's available for Matrix to actually bridge into a Discord server that we set up for those who didn't want to use Matrix and who use Discord extensively. And we also bridged into IRC, so we could set up a few IRC rooms, and with those bridges, everyone is effectively communicating in one giant room, regardless of what actual protocol they're using, which has been a huge boon for especially just end user troubleshooting. We're able to support people on, as we've said a few times, wherever they are and whatever they want to use.
Anthony Lovato, release manager, Joshua Boniface, the project lead, and One Hit Song software maintainer for the Roku client. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Ask Noah. I really appreciate the enthusiasm, what you're doing for the open source community. We'll get you back on the program soon.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
So that's actually a nice lead-in to Matrix 2.0. So Matrix 1.0 came out in 2020, and the timing was particularly great because we were using it for self. We soon after switched for Ultispeed, and have been using it now to power our community chat room, which you can find at geeklab.ninja. If you have had a struggle in the past, I highly recommend you check out what Matrix has been doing since that time. I want to play a clip from FOSDEM where Matthew was presenting.
So we have gone deep down the rabbit hole, so the saying goes, to try to optimize the performance on Element X so it is as snappy as iMessage or WhatsApp or Telegram, rather than the slightly clunky beast that we've had historically.
And they have demos of this, so you can actually see it in action. And what they've done is they've gone to something called sliding sync, which makes it way, way more performant.
The key design criteria for sliding sync is that performance is constant with the number of rooms. And this was a horrible mistake with the old API, and frankly the whole design of Matrix historically, that as you join more rooms, it gets linearly slower for basically everything. And that was fine for the first few years when people are in a couple of hundred rooms, but obviously we don't want to predicate the success of the protocol on, yeah, it's fine as long as you're not a power user, or it's fine as long as you don't actually use it.
And so what they have done is they've gone from the Matrix, what they're calling 1.0 experience, to the Matrix 2.0 experience.
So for instance, in Matrix HQ right now, there are 92,948 state events for every user who has ever joined or changed their name or left, and a whole bunch of other things. If you actually look at the subset you need to participate in the room, it's 152. So this speeds up the room join time from 15 minutes to 14 seconds. So finally, we will hopefully have fixed the problem where somebody apt-get installs Matrix Synapse, immediately tries to join Matrix HQ, sits there for 15 minutes looking at errors as their computer explodes and wonders why everybody thinks Matrix is as amazing as it is.
So if that's you, if that resembles your experience, then I highly recommend you go check out the latest version of Matrix. Give Element another shot. We record the show on Tuesday, 6 p.m. Central. We invite you to join us live for the show. It's the best way to experience it, but you can find all of the show notes and references, resources. They're available at podcast.asknoahshow.com. Have a good week. See you next week.